Marcus Blake stood in the bright lights of trading station Kepler 442 and looked at his favorite vehicle with pride. The silver fusion drive cruiser was beautiful and rare. Only 300 of these machines existed in the entire galaxy. Marcus had built this vehicle himself by combining Earth car technology with alien spacecraft engines. It was a masterpiece that brought together two worlds of engineering. 20 years had passed since Marcus first arrived at this station. Back then he carried only a small bag and a big dream. He knew nothing about running a business in space, but he understood vehicles better than anyone. While other humans struggled to find their place among the alien species, Marcus found his calling. He opened a small shop that fixed and improved vehicles. His work was so good that wealthy beings from many different species started coming to him. Blake Stellar Motors grew slowly but steadily over the years. The tiny repair shop became a proper dealership. Marcus hired workers from 6 different alien species. 47 beings now worked for him. They sold vehicles to some of the richest creatures in this part of space. Marcus ran an honest business in a sector where most dealers tried to cheat their customers. People respected him for that. On this particular afternoon, Marcus was showing the Fusion Cruiser to a potential buyer. The buyer was a Dronei merchant who had traveled 3 star systems to see this vehicle. Marcus explained how the fusion drive worked and pointed out the custom interior. The Dronei seemed very interested, and Marcus thought he might close the sale today. Then the Galactic Enforcement Patrol arrived. 4 officers came walking quickly toward Marcus and his customer. 2 of them were Vrex and 2 were Zenthari. All 4 had their weapons out and pointed forward. The lead officer was a tall Vrex named Krell. He aimed his plasma rifle directly at Marcus. "Step away from the vehicle," Krell said through his translation device. The device turned his alien clicks and whistles into cold mechanical words that everyone could understand. Marcus slowly raised both hands into the air. "Officer, there must be some mistake," he said calmly. "This is my vehicle and I own this dealership." Krell moved closer with his weapon still raised. "Registration shows this vehicle belongs to Victor Strand, who is a Terran businessman," Krell said. "You match the description of a suspect wanted for vehicle theft across 3 systems." The other 3 officers spread out and surrounded Marcus. Before he could explain anything more, they grabbed him and forced him down to the cold station floor. They put energy cuffs on his wrists. The cuffs hummed with containment fields that made his hands tingle. Marcus felt the hard floor pressing against his face. The Dronei merchant who had been interested in buying the vehicle quickly walked away. He wanted nothing to do with what looked like a criminal situation. Marcus watched his potential sale disappear along with his dignity. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, with his face still pressed against the floor. "Check the ownership records right now. Call my office. I can prove this is my vehicle and my business. All thieves say that." One of the Zenthari officers muttered as they pulled Marcus to his feet. Marcus was taken to the Galactic Enforcement Detention Center in the lower levels of the station. The holding cell was designed for beings much larger than humans. Everything was too big and uncomfortable. He sat on a bench that was too high and waited. Hours passed slowly. Finally, they brought him to an interrogation room. Krell sat across from him reviewing data on a holographic display. Marcus could see images and text floating in the air, but he could not read them from his position. The Vrex officer took his time looking through the information. "Your story is inconsistent," Krell said without looking up from his display. "A human operating a successful dealership in this sector seems unlikely. Most humans work service positions or labor jobs." Marcus felt anger rising, but he kept his voice steady. "That is because of prejudice like yours," he replied. "I have been here for 20 years. Blake Stellar Motors employs nearly 50 people. We have contracts with some of the wealthiest beings in this quadrant." Krell finally looked at Marcus directly. "The vehicle registration shows Victor Strand as the owner," he said. "The vehicle identification matches a theft report filed 3 days ago. Victor Strand is my business partner," Marcus explained. "He handles our operations on other stations and planets. The vehicle is registered under our corporate entity for tax purposes, but it is displayed at my dealership. Check the dealership cameras and you will see. Check our business licenses. This is all easily verifiable." The Vrex officer made a dismissive gesture with one of his clawed hands. "I have seen false documentation before," Krell said. "Sophisticated thieves often prepare elaborate covers for their crimes." Marcus leaned forward as much as the cuffs would allow. Then check with Victor directly, he said.
Call him right now.
He will verify everything I'm telling you. Victor Strand is currently unreachable, Krell replied. He is in transit between systems. We will have to wait for him to respond to our inquiries. So you are holding me based on an assumption, Marcus said. We are holding you based on evidence and a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, Krell said. Marcus understood what was really happening even if Krell would never admit it out loud. He fit a profile. Dark-skinned humans showed up in galactic enforcement databases for petty crimes more often than other humans. This was not because they committed more crimes, but because they were stopped and questioned and arrested more frequently. The same prejudice that existed on Earth for thousands of years had followed humanity into space. Worse than that, the alien law enforcement officers had learned this prejudice from humans without understanding where it came from or why it was wrong. Krell saw a dark-skinned human standing next to an expensive vehicle and immediately assumed theft. He did not check basic facts. He did not verify ownership. He just made an arrest based on appearance and assumptions. This was the reality that Marcus and many other humans faced every day in the galaxy. Marcus sat back in his chair and looked at Krell. How long are you going to keep me here? He asked. Until we verify your story or Victor Strand responds to our inquiry, Krell said. That could take several days. Several days, Marcus repeated. You are going to keep an innocent businessman locked up for several days because you could not be bothered to check public records before making an arrest. Krell stood up. The interview is over, he said. You will be returned to your cell. As guards escorted Marcus back to the holding area, he thought about his business and his employees. Lisa Grant, his operations manager, would be worried when he did not return. She would start looking for him. Marcus hoped she would know what to do. He hoped someone would believe him even if galactic enforcement did not. News traveled fast on trading station Kepler 442. Within 3 hours of Marcus Blake's arrest, everyone in the human community knew what had happened. His employees at Blake Stellar Motors were the first to react. Lisa Grant, his operations manager, immediately closed the dealership and gathered the staff together. She told them what little she knew and promised to find out more. Lisa was a sharp woman who had worked with Marcus for 12 years. She understood how the station operated, and she knew that this arrest was wrong. She started making calls. First, she contacted their legal team. Then she pulled every piece of documentation that proved Marcus owned the dealership and the vehicle. Business licenses, registration papers, tax records, security camera footage from the showroom. She compiled everything into a clear, organized file. But Lisa did something else that would prove even more important. She contacted the media. Within hours, the story was spreading across human news networks throughout the sector. The security footage from the dealership showed everything. Marcus standing next to his own vehicle at his own business during normal working hours. Officers arriving with weapons drawn. Marcus being forced to the ground and handcuffed while trying to explain that he owned the dealership. The images were powerful, and they made people angry. This was not just about one man being wrongly arrested. This was about a pattern that many humans recognized from their own experiences. By the next morning, the story had exploded across every human communication channel in the sector. Gregory Cole, a prominent human rights advocate, appeared on the largest news broadcast. This is exactly the kind of treatment we left Earth to escape, he said into the camera. We came to the stars hoping for equality. We hoped that leaving our home planet would mean leaving behind the prejudices that divided us for so long. But we brought our prejudices with us into space, and worse, we have taught them to our alien neighbors. His words struck a chord with humans across the sector. Many had experienced similar treatment. Being stopped for no reason. Being questioned about their right to be in certain areas. Being assumed to be criminals or servants rather than professionals. The Marcus Blake case gave them a focus for their frustration. By the afternoon after Marcus's arrest, a small group of humans gathered outside the Galactic Enforcement Headquarters. They carried signs with simple messages. Check your bias. Business owner, not criminal. Judge actions, not appearance. The group was peaceful but determined. They stood in the plaza where everyone entering or leaving the enforcement building had to see them. The small group grew quickly. By evening, there were hundreds of humans in the plaza. By the next morning, there were thousands. Humans traveled from other parts of the station, and even from nearby stations, to join the protest. They organized themselves efficiently. Some people brought food and water. Others set up charging stations for communication devices. Medical volunteers stood ready in case anyone needed help. The demonstration remained completely peaceful. No one threw anything or damaged property. No one threatened the enforcement officers. But the protest was impossible to ignore. Thousands of humans standing together in organized solidarity made a powerful statement. They sang songs from Earth's civil rights movements. They chanted simple slogans. They held up images of Marcus being arrested. Humans had a reputation in the galaxy for being persistent and emotional. Other species often found human stubbornness annoying. When most species encountered a problem with authority, they would file a complaint and wait for the official process to work. Humans were different. They had thousands of years of history fighting against injustice. They had cultural traditions of protest and civil disobedience that went back to ancient times. When humans believed something was wrong, they did not simply accept official explanations and move on. What made this protest even more powerful was that it was not just humans. Members of other species started joining the demonstration. A drone-eye merchant named Kelvin, who had purchased 5 vehicles from Blake Stellar Motors over the years, gave an interview to a news service. "Marcus Blake is the most honest dealer I have ever worked with," Kelvin said. "He treats everyone fairly regardless of their species. The idea that he is a criminal is absurd." A Xanthari mechanic named Vex, who had trained under Marcus at the dealership, also spoke publicly. "Marcus gave me opportunities that other human employers would not give to a Xanthari," Vex explained. "He judged me on my skills, not on prejudices about my species. He deserves the same fair treatment." More aliens joined the protest in the plaza. They came because they had worked with Marcus or done business with him. They came because they recognized injustice when they saw it. The presence of non-humans in the crowd made it harder for galactic enforcement to dismiss the protest as simply humans complaining. Inside, the Galactic Enforcement Headquarters Commander Zalith watched the growing protest from her office window. She was a Vrex officer who had been in charge of the Enforcement Division on Kepler 442 for 8 years. She had handled protests before, but never anything like this. The crowd kept growing. The media coverage kept expanding. The pressure kept building. Zalith called Krell to her office. "Explain to me why we still have Marcus Blake in detention," she said without taking her eyes off the protest below. Krell stood stiffly. "The evidence suggested vehicle theft, Commander," he said. "The registration indicated that Victor Strand owned the vehicle and we had reports of theft." Zalith turned to face him. "I have reviewed your report," she said coldly. "You arrested a man standing next to a vehicle at his own dealership during business hours while he was conducting a sale. Did you verify his identity before making the arrest? Did you contact the dealership to confirm his story? Did you check business registrations in the public database?" Krell's mandibles clicked nervously. "We acted on information that suggested criminal activity," he said. "You acted on a profile," Zalith said. "I have seen the security footage. You saw a dark-skinned human near an expensive vehicle and made assumptions. Now we have a public relations disaster and a potential lawsuit that could cost this department millions in damages." She pulled up a holographic display showing the documentation that Lisa Grant had provided. "Blake Stellar Motors is a licensed, registered business with a 20-year operating history," Zalith said. "Marcus Blake is the sole proprietor. Victor Strand is listed as a minority partner handling off-station operations. The vehicle in question is registered to their corporate entity, which is standard practice. All of this information was available in public databases. It would have taken you approximately 30 seconds to verify these facts before making an arrest." Krell said nothing. There was nothing he could say. "Release him immediately," Zalith ordered. "Prepare a formal apology. We are going to need serious damage control for this situation." After Krell left, Zalith sat at her desk and continued reviewing the case files. What troubled her most was realizing this was not an isolated incident. She pulled up arrest and detention records for the past year. The data showed a disturbing pattern. Humans, particularly those with darker skin, were stopped and arrested at rates much higher than other species. She had dismissed these statistics before as random variation. Now she was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Her department had absorbed human prejudices without understanding their historical context. Her officers were treating certain humans differently based on their appearance. This bias was leading to unjust arrests, and it was damaging relationships between galactic enforcement and the communities they were supposed to serve. The Marcus Blake incident had exposed a systemic problem that could no longer be ignored. Marcus Blake walked out of the Galactic Enforcement Detention Center after 36 hours in custody. The moment he stepped through the doors, he saw hundreds of people waiting for him. Cameras from a dozen different news services pointed in his direction. Signs waved in the air. People started cheering when they saw him. Lisa Grant pushed through the crowd and reached him first. She hugged him tightly. "Are you okay?" she asked. Marcus nodded, though exhaustion showed clearly on his face. "I have been through worse," he said. "But Lisa, this cannot just end with me walking free. This happens to other humans all the time, and nobody notices because they do not own dealerships. They do not have the resources to fight back. We need to make sure this leads to real change." Before his release, Commander Zelith had requested a private meeting with Marcus. She offered a formal apology, which he accepted, though he remained cautious. But then she showed him something that surprised him. She displayed enforcement data on a holographic screen. Over the past standard year, humans represent 12% of this station's population, Zelith had explained. However, they account for 41% of stops and searches. When I analyze the data more carefully, I see that humans with darker skin pigmentation are stopped at rates 3 times higher than lighter-skinned humans. They are stopped 5 times more often than comparable alien species in similar circumstances. Marcus had stared at the numbers floating in the holographic display. He suspected bias existed, but seeing it quantified in clear data was different. "What are you going to do about it?" he had asked. "I do not know yet," Zelith admitted. "But ignoring this problem is not an option anymore. I need to understand why this is happening and how to fix it. I need your help and the help of your community to make changes that actually work." Now, standing outside with Lisa and the crowd of supporters, Marcus made his decision. He raised his hand and the crowd gradually became quiet. People wanted to hear what he would say. "We are not letting this go quietly," Marcus announced. His voice was tired but firm. "I am filing a civil lawsuit against Galactic Enforcement for unlawful detention and discrimination. But more than that, I am going to make sure every human on this station knows their rights. We need to document these incidents when they happen. We need to collect evidence. We need to make the patterns visible so they cannot be ignored or dismissed." The crowd erupted in cheers. Marcus continued speaking. "We came to the stars to escape this kind of treatment. Our ancestors fought for centuries on Earth against prejudice and discrimination. We are not going to accept it just because the badges are worn by aliens instead of humans. We deserve better, and we are going to fight for it. Not with violence, but with persistence and truth. We will document every unjust stop. We will record every discriminatory encounter. We will make the evidence impossible to deny." The response from the human community was immediate and organized. Within days, they had created a system for reporting and documenting enforcement encounters. People could submit details about stops and searches. They could upload video evidence. Legal volunteers reviewed each report to identify patterns and potential violations of rights. The database grew quickly. A maintenance worker named Carl Newton reported being stopped 17 times in one standard year, while traveling between his living quarters and his workplace. Each time the officers asked him where he was going and what he was doing. They searched his belongings repeatedly. They never found anything illegal because Carl had done nothing wrong. But the constant stops made him feel like a criminal in his own home. A teacher named Nicole Hayes submitted her story. Enforcement officers had entered her classroom one day and questioned her in front of her students. They said they received a report about someone trespassing in the school. Nicole taught at that school for 5 years, but the officers assumed she did not belong there. Her students watched as she had to prove she was their teacher. The humiliation stayed with her long after the officers left. These stories and hundreds more painted a clear picture of systematic bias. The human community began organizing meetings to discuss the issue. They invited members of other species to attend and learn. These were not angry confrontations. They were honest conversations designed to build understanding between different groups. Lisa Grant took charge of organizing community forums. She found meeting spaces and arranged schedules. She made sure that humans who experienced discrimination could share their stories in a safe environment. She also made sure that aliens who wanted to understand the issue could attend and ask questions. At one forum, a drone merchant named Kelvin stood up to speak. "I thought I understood discrimination," he said. "My species faced persecution in our home system centuries ago. We know what it feels like to be treated unfairly, but I did not realize I had learned to see humans through a biased lens. I made assumptions about human capabilities and human honesty without realizing it. These forums have helped me recognize patterns in my own thinking that I had not noticed before. I am grateful for this education, even though it makes me uncomfortable to acknowledge my own prejudices. His words represented a breakthrough. Other aliens began acknowledging their own biases. A Xanthari business owner admitted that he had unconsciously passed over human job applicants because he assumed they would not be as reliable as alien workers. A Vrex administrator realized that public facilities in human majority districts received less maintenance funding than comparable areas with more alien residents. The movement gained strength because it focused on specific, measurable changes rather than vague calls for justice. The human community demanded body cameras for all enforcement officers. They pushed for civilian oversight boards with real authority to investigate complaints. They created public databases to track stop and search patterns over time. They demanded regular bias training for all enforcement personnel. Marcus became a spokesperson for the movement, though he always insisted he was just one voice among many. He used his business platform and his public profile to advocate for change. But he also made sure to amplify other voices, particularly those of humans who did not have his resources or visibility. He brought Carl Newton and Nicole Hayes and dozens of others into interviews and public appearances. He wanted people to understand that this was not just about one wealthy businessman. This was about entire communities being treated unfairly. In an interview with a major news service, Marcus explained his perspective. "This is not about me," he said directly into the camera. "This is about creating a society where everyone is judged by their actions, not their appearance. That is supposed to be one of the benefits of living in a multi-species community. We have an opportunity to be better than we were on Earth, but we have to work actively to make that happen. We have to confront our biases. We have to change our systems. We have to hold ourselves accountable." The pressure on galactic enforcement continued to build. The protests remained peaceful but persistent. The media coverage remained focused on the issue. The documentation of discriminatory stops kept growing. The station leadership could no longer ignore the problem. Something had to change, and everyone knew it. 6 months after his arrest, Marcus Blake stood in front of the station council chambers. His lawsuit against galactic enforcement was still working its way through the legal system, but today was about something bigger. The council was voting on the Equitable Enforcement Act. This legislation would make many of the changes the human community had demanded into official station law. The council chambers were packed with people. Humans filled most of the seats, but members of other species were there too. Everyone wanted to witness this moment. Lisa Grant sat in the front row. Carl Newton and Nicole Hayes were there. Karen Phillips, the historian who had educated the enforcement officers, attended. Even Commander Zealith came to observe the vote. The proposed legislation covered many areas. It required body cameras for all enforcement officers with footage available for review by the Oversight Committee. It mandated regular bias training with input from affected communities. It established clear documentation requirements for stops and searches. Officers would need to articulate specific reasons for their actions. It created a civilian oversight board with real investigative authority and the power to recommend disciplinary measures. It required regular public reporting of stop and search data broken down by demographic groups. Some council members had fought against these provisions. They argued the measures went too far. They claimed the oversight would make enforcement work impossible. They suggested that the human community was overreacting to a single incident. But the evidence was too strong to ignore. The data showed clear patterns of discriminatory treatment. The documentation of individual cases painted a compelling picture. The peaceful but persistent protests had kept public attention focused on the issue. When the vote came, the Equitable Enforcement Act passed by a margin of 7-4. It was not unanimous, and some provisions had been weakened during negotiations. But it represented real progress. The council had officially recognized that discrimination existed and committed to addressing it through concrete, measurable changes. The crowd erupted in applause when the results were announced. People hugged each other. Some cried with relief and joy. This victory had required months of work, countless hours of organizing and documenting and advocating. The human community had refused to give up, and now they had achieved something meaningful. Marcus stepped outside the chambers where reporters waited with cameras and questions. "How do you feel about the vote?" one reporter asked. Marcus took a moment to gather his thoughts. I feel hopeful, he said. This legislation is not perfect. Some of us wanted stronger provisions, but it represents real change. It acknowledges that discrimination happened and commits to preventing it in the future. That matters. What matters even more is that we built a coalition to make this happen. Humans and aliens working together to create a more just system. That gives me hope for the future. Another reporter asked what message he had for other humans facing similar discrimination in other parts of the galaxy. Document everything, Marcus replied. Record your encounters with enforcement. Organize with your community. Do not accept discrimination as inevitable. We have centuries of history fighting against injustice. We know how to do this work. It takes persistence and courage, but change is possible. What happened here on Kepler 442 can happen anywhere humans refuse to accept unfair treatment. The impact of the Equitable Enforcement Act spread beyond Kepler 442. News of the legislation reached other stations and colonies. Human communities in other locations began organizing similar efforts. They used the documentation methods developed on Kepler 442. They adopted the same strategies for building coalitions with other species. They demanded similar accountability measures from their local enforcement agencies. Some enforcement agencies in neighboring sectors implemented reforms voluntarily. They saw what happened on Kepler 442 and decided they did not want to face similar protests and public pressure. The changes made by Commander Zelith became a model that other agencies studied and adapted. Human persistence was effectively forcing systemic changes across multiple jurisdictions. Drone-Eye merchant named Kelvin, who had supported Marcus from the beginning, reflected on what the movement had accomplished. I learned so much from watching the human community organize, he said in an interview. They showed us how to fight injustice effectively. They taught us that change requires sustained effort, not just momentary outrage. They demonstrated that peaceful protest combined with clear demands and solid evidence can overcome institutional resistance. These are lessons my species needs to learn. Other species began applying similar techniques to address their own experiences with discrimination. A group of Xanthari workers facing wage discrimination formed an advocacy organization modeled on the human community groups. They documented pay disparities and organized protests. Within 4 months, they secured an agreement for equal pay policies. They credited the human community on Kepler 442 for showing them how to fight effectively. Marcus watched these developments with satisfaction, but also with awareness that the work was not finished. Implementation of the Equitable Enforcement Act would require constant monitoring. The Civilian Oversight Board would need support and resources. Bias training would need to be updated and improved over time. Data collection would need to be maintained and analyzed regularly. This was not a problem that could be solved once and forgotten. It required ongoing attention and effort. He established the Blake Foundation to provide resources for this continuing work. The foundation offered legal assistance to humans facing discrimination. It funded community organizing efforts. It supported research into bias and discrimination. The fusion cruiser that had been at the center of his arrest was sold at a charity auction. The proceeds went to the foundation along with donations from supporters across the sector. Lisa Grant became the foundation's executive director. She brought the same organizational skills she used at the dealership to this new challenge. She hired staff and established programs. She built relationships with similar organizations in other locations. The foundation quickly became a central resource for humans fighting discrimination throughout the sector. At a foundation fundraising event 6 months after the Equitable Enforcement Act passed, Marcus gave a speech to donors and supporters. We have accomplished something remarkable, he said. We took an incident of injustice and used it as a catalyst for systemic change. We refused to accept discrimination as normal or inevitable. We organized ourselves. We built coalitions. We gathered evidence. We demanded accountability. And we succeeded in creating real measurable improvements in how enforcement treats our community. He paused and looked around the room at the diverse group of beings who had come together to support this work. But I want to be clear about something, he continued. This is not just about protecting humans from discrimination. This is about building a society where everyone is treated fairly regardless of their species or appearance. When we fight against bias, we fight for everyone. When we demand accountability, we make systems better for all beings. That is why we have supporters from so many different species. This is not a human issue. This is a justice issue. The crowd applauded. Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a recognition that this work would continue for years to come. Changing hearts and minds took time. Transforming institutions required sustained pressure. But humans were good at sustained pressure. They were excellent at refusing to give up when they believed something was right. That stubborn persistence was perhaps humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy. After the event, Commander Zelith approached Marcus. She had become a regular supporter of the Foundation's work. "I wanted you to know that the changes are holding," she said. "Our discriminatory stop rates are down 73% compared to before we implemented the reforms. Officer compliance with documentation requirements is at 92%. Complaints about unfair treatment have dropped by 60%. The data shows that real change is happening." Marcus smiled. "That is good to hear," he said. "But we will keep monitoring the situation closely. Data can be misleading if people know they are being measured. We need to make sure the improvements are genuine and lasting." "I would expect nothing less," Zelith replied. "Your community's vigilance keeps us honest. That is exactly how it should work." Commander Zelith stood at her office window and watched another protest gathering in the plaza below. The humans had been demonstrating peacefully for 2 weeks. The crowds remained large and organized. The media coverage continued without pause. The pressure on her department grew heavier each day. She knew that simply releasing Marcus Blake was not enough. The situation demanded real systemic change. Zelith made a decision that was unusual for someone in her position. She asked for help. She reached out to human cultural experts and historians. She wanted to understand the context behind the patterns she was seeing in her department's data. She needed to know why this bias existed and how it could be addressed effectively. A historian named Karen Phillips responded to her request. Karen specialized in human social movements and the history of discrimination. She agreed to give a presentation to Galactic Enforcement leadership. The presentation lasted 4 hours, and it changed how many officers understood the issue. Karen began by explaining the history of racial law profiling on Earth. She showed images and videos from different time periods. She described how certain groups of humans had been systematically targeted by law enforcement for centuries. She explained the civil rights movements that had fought against these practices. She detailed how discrimination patterns persisted, even as humanity expanded into space and encountered alien species. "What you have to understand," Karen said to the assembled officers, "is that bias is not always conscious or intentional. It gets built into systems over time. It gets reinforced by data that reflects historical prejudice rather than actual criminal behavior. It gets perpetuated through training that does not account for these factors. When your officers see patterns in crime data showing higher arrest rates for certain demographics, they often do not stop to ask why those patterns exist." She displayed statistics from Earth history on the holographic screens. The numbers showed remarkably similar patterns across different cultures and time periods. If you stop and search one group more frequently than others, you will naturally find more violations in that group, Karen explained. This creates data that appears to justify more stops and searches of that same group. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. The bias feeds itself and grows stronger over time, unless someone consciously interrupts the pattern. Zelith observed her officers carefully as they absorbed this information. Some showed genuine surprise. They had not realized they were perpetuating historical patterns of discrimination. Others appeared defensive. They did not want to believe they were biased. A few looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing their own behavior in the examples Karen presented. The Marcus Blake incident is a perfect example of unconscious bias in action, Karen continued. An officer saw a dark-skinned human standing near an expensive vehicle. Without conscious thought, the officer made certain assumptions based on internalized stereotypes. The officer did not verify basic facts before making an arrest. This did not happen because the officer was intentionally malicious. It happened because the bias was unconscious and unchecked. The officer genuinely believed he was responding appropriately to a suspicious situation. But that belief was shaped by prejudices he did not even realize he held. After the presentation ended, Zelith announced immediate changes to department procedures. She mandated comprehensive bias training for all enforcement personnel. Every officer would attend regular sessions designed to help them recognize and counteract their own unconscious prejudices. She also implemented new protocols requiring officers to document their reasoning for stops and searches. They would need to explain what specific behavior or evidence justified their actions. Beyond simply having a suspicion, Seelith established an oversight committee that included representatives from the human community. This committee would have authority to review enforcement actions and investigate complaints. They could access all department records and body camera footage. They could recommend disciplinary action when officers violated protocols. This was real accountability, not just empty promises. The changes were not popular with everyone in the department. Some officers complained loudly that they were being accused of crimes they did not commit. Others argued that the new procedures would make their jobs harder and more dangerous. A few threatened to resign rather than submit to oversight from civilians. Seelith addressed these complaints directly during a department-wide meeting. "Our job is to serve and protect all beings on this station," she said firmly. "If our procedures are harming innocent people based on their appearance, then we are failing at that fundamental job. This is not about making your lives harder or accusing you of being bad people. This is about recognizing that we have absorbed biases from human culture without understanding their harmful effects. We need to do better. We will do better." She made it clear that officers who could not accept these changes should find other employment. The department would not tolerate discrimination. Officers who violated the new protocols would face serious consequences, including termination. This was not optional. This was the new standard. Over the following weeks, Seelith worked closely with Karen Phillips and other experts to develop the training program. They brought in humans who had experienced discrimination to share their stories directly with enforcement officers. They used real case studies, including the Marcus Blake incident, to illustrate how bias affected actual enforcement decisions. They taught officers specific techniques for checking their assumptions and verifying facts before taking action. The training was difficult for many officers. Confronting your own biases is uncomfortable. Admitting that you have treated people unfairly, even unintentionally, is painful. But it was necessary. Some officers resisted at first, but gradually came to understand why the changes mattered. Others embraced the training, eagerly recognizing that it would help them do their jobs better and more fairly. Seelith also implemented changes to how the department collected and analyzed data. They would track stops and searches by officer and by demographic group. They would look for patterns that might indicate bias. Officers whose stop rates showed significant disparities would receive additional training and closer supervision. The department would actively monitor for discrimination rather than waiting for complaints to reveal problems. The human community watched these changes with cautious optimism. They had seen promises before that led nowhere. They wanted to see actual results, not just policy statements. Marcus and Lisa and other community leaders maintained regular communication with Seelith. They reviewed the implementation of new protocols. They provided feedback on what was working and what needed improvement. 3 months after the training began, the data started showing real change. The number of stops involving humans decreased significantly. The rate of searches that found no violations dropped sharply. Complaints about discriminatory treatment declined. Officers were taking more time to verify facts before making arrests. They were documenting their reasoning more carefully. The self-reinforcing cycle of bias was beginning to break. Not everything changed overnight. Some officers still showed bias in their actions. Some situations still resulted in unfair treatment. But the overall trajectory was positive. The department was genuinely trying to address the problem, rather than denying it existed. That represented real progress. Seelith met regularly with Marcus during this period. She wanted his perspective on how the changes were affecting the community. She asked for his honest assessment of what was working. Marcus appreciated her willingness to listen and learn. He told her that trust would take time to rebuild, but the effort was noticed and valued. "You are doing something difficult," Marcus said during one of their meetings. "You are asking your officers to examine themselves and change their behavior. That is much harder than just changing a policy or a procedure, but it is also the only way to create lasting change. Systems are made of people. If the people do not change, the system will not change no matter what the rules say." Seelith nodded in agreement. "Your community taught me that," she said. "You refused to accept easy answers or superficial fixes. You demanded real accountability and real change. That persistence made all the difference. Without it, I might have made token gestures and moved on, but you would not let that happen." 1 year after his arrest, Marcus Blake walked through the expanded showroom of Blake Stellar Motors. The dealership had grown significantly. The publicity from his case had brought attention to his business. More importantly, it had established his reputation as someone who stood for principles beyond profit. Customers respected that, and they showed it by bringing him their business. The dealership now employed 73 people from 9 different species. Marcus had deliberately sought out workers from groups that faced discrimination in hiring. He gave opportunities to beings that other employers passed over because of prejudice. His workforce included former criminals trying to rebuild their lives. It included refugees from war-torn systems. It included young people from poor backgrounds who needed their first chance. Marcus believed that everyone deserved to be judged on their abilities, not their history or appearance. The Fusion cruiser that started everything had been sold at auction. A wealthy collector paid twice the original asking price because of the vehicle's connection to the discrimination case. All proceeds went to the Blake Foundation. That cruiser became a symbol. Pictures of Marcus being handcuffed next to it had spread across the galaxy. Now it represented the fight against injustice and the power of peaceful resistance. Lisa Grant had successfully transitioned to leading the foundation, but she still helped Marcus with major dealership decisions. She understood both aspects of his work and helped maintain connections between the business and the advocacy efforts. On this particular day, she came to his office with news. 3 more stations have adopted versions of the Equitable Enforcement Act, she told him. They used our model and adapted it for their local situations. The movement is spreading faster than we expected. Marcus felt pride but also concern. That is excellent news, he said. But we need to make sure these other locations have the resources to implement the reforms effectively. Laws on paper mean nothing if they are not enforced properly. Can the foundation help them set up oversight committees and training programs? Lisa nodded. I am already working on it. We are creating a toolkit that other communities can use. It includes all the documentation methods we developed. It has sample training materials. It explains how to set up oversight structures. We want to make it as easy as possible for other places to replicate our success. This was how change spread, Marcus realized. One community fought hard and achieved results. Then they shared what they learned with others. Those communities adapted the lessons to their own situations. Gradually, the changes became widespread enough to shift the entire culture. It required patience and sustained effort, but it worked. Commander Zelith had become an unexpected ally and friend. She regularly spoke at conferences about implementing bias reduction in law enforcement. Other enforcement leaders invited her to consult on their reform efforts. She had written a widely read paper about unconscious bias in multi-species policing. Her willingness to acknowledge mistakes and learn from them made her a powerful voice for change. She visited the dealership one afternoon to discuss a new challenge. We are seeing resistance from some officers, she told Marcus. They comply with the letter of the new policies, but not the spirit. They find ways to justify discriminatory stops using the documentation requirements. They write reports that technically meet the standards, but the underlying bias remains. Marcus was not surprised. Changing behavior is harder than changing policies, he said. Some people will always resist. The question is whether you have enough officers who genuinely embrace the reforms to create a new culture. Culture change comes from the majority, not from converting every single person. Zelith considered this. Most of my officers have accepted the changes, she said. Some even enthusiastically support them. They appreciate having clear guidelines and better training. But there is a core group that views the reforms as a tax on their judgment and authority. I do not know how to reach them. Maybe you cannot reach all of them, Marcus suggested. Maybe some of them need to find other careers. If they cannot or will not treat all beings fairly, they should not be enforcement officers. That might sound harsh, but public safety requires trust. Communities cannot trust officers who view them with suspicion and prejudice. Zelith slowly nodded. You are right, of course. I have been reluctant to push anyone out. But keeping biased officers does more harm than removing them. I will start performance reviews focused on compliance with bias reduction protocols. Officers who consistently fail to meet standards will face consequences, including termination. The conversation reflected a broader truth about systemic change. Laws and policies created frameworks, but real transformation required accountability. It required leaders willing to enforce standards even when doing so was uncomfortable. It required removing people who refused to change. This was hard work that never really ended. Marcus continued balancing his business responsibilities with his advocacy work. He gave speeches at universities and conferences. He met with community organizers from other stations. He worked with the foundation to expand its programs. He also testified before the sector-wide governing council about the need for uniform standards on enforcement practices. Some humans criticized him for not pushing harder or demanding more radical changes. Others thanked him for finding a middle path that achieved real results without alienating potential allies. Marcus understood both perspectives. Change required balance between pushing boundaries and building sustainable coalitions. Push too hard and you lose support. Push too softly and nothing changes. Finding the right balance was more art than science. He also dealt with criticism from aliens who thought humans were making too much noise about discrimination. Some argued that all species faced challenges, and humans should accept their situation like everyone else. Marcus responded to these criticisms patiently. He explained that accepting injustice was not a virtue. He pointed out that fighting discrimination helped all beings, not just humans. He showed how bias reduction improved public safety and community relations for everyone. Slowly, these arguments changed minds. A Xanthari business leader who initially opposed the reforms wrote a public letter acknowledging he had been wrong. "Since the changes, my interactions with enforcement have improved," he wrote. "I did not realize how often I was stopped for minor issues until the pattern changed. The new protocols protect everyone, not just humans. I apologize for my initial resistance." These moments of genuine reflection from former opponents meant more to Marcus than praise from supporters. They showed that minds could change, and that sustained advocacy could overcome initial resistance. They proved that building understanding between species was possible even across significant cultural and historical divides. At a foundation board meeting, Marcus reflected on how far they had come and how far they still needed to go. "We have achieved measurable progress," he told the board members. "Discriminatory stops are down across multiple stations. Bias training is becoming standard practice. Oversight committees are functioning. These are real victories worth celebrating." He paused before continuing. "But we also need to be realistic about the limitations of what we have accomplished. We focused on law enforcement because that is where my case gave us leverage. But discrimination exists in housing and employment and education and many other areas. We need to expand our work to address these issues. We need to maintain pressure on enforcement, while also opening new fronts in the fight for equality." The board members nodded in agreement. This was the nature of social justice work. Each victory revealed new challenges. Each success created opportunities to push further. The work never truly ended because building a just society required constant effort and vigilance. Lisa spoke up. "We have requests from 17 different locations asking for help addressing housing discrimination," she said. "We have the expertise now. We understand how to document patterns and build coalitions and advocate for policy changes. We can adapt our model to these new challenges." The board voted to expand the foundation's scope. They would continue supporting enforcement reform, while also taking on housing and employment discrimination. They would hire additional staff with expertise in these areas. They would develop new programs and tools. The movement that began with one man being wrongly arrested would grow into a comprehensive fight for equality across all aspects of society. Marcus left the meeting, feeling energized despite the enormity of the challenges ahead. This was humanity's gift to the galaxy, he thought. The absolute refusal to accept injustice, the stubborn insistence that things could and should be better, the willingness to fight for generations if necessary to create a more fair society. Other species might see this as exhausting or unrealistic, but humans knew from long experience that this persistence was how real change happened. 2 years had passed since Marcus Blake was handcuffed outside his own dealership. The incident that could have destroyed his life had instead become a catalyst for change that spread across the sector and beyond. Marcus stood in the conference room of Blake Stellar Motors, watching a news broadcast about enforcement reform on a station 3 systems away. They were using the model developed on Kepler 442. They cited his case as inspiration for their own activism. The Blake Foundation had grown into a major organization with offices on 5 different stations. They had helped more than 2,000 humans navigate discrimination complaints. They had trained community organizers in 17 locations. They had provided expert testimony for 32 legal cases. Their documentation methodology had become the standard approach for tracking bias in enforcement encounters across human communities throughout the galaxy. More importantly, the Foundation had begun working on issues beyond enforcement. They launched a housing fairness initiative that documented discriminatory rental and sales practices. They created an employment equity program that helped humans file complaints about workplace discrimination. They partnered with educational institutions to address bias in admissions and student treatment. The work kept expanding because the need kept revealing itself. Lisa Grant managed the Foundation's rapid growth with the same organizational skills she once applied to running the dealership. She built a strong staff team and established clear processes. She maintained relationships with partner organizations across the sector. She kept Marcus informed but also shielded him from day-to-day operational details so he could focus on strategic direction and public advocacy. Marcus had become a prominent figure in human communities across the galaxy. He received speaking invitations from dozens of locations. Universities offered him honorary positions. Political leaders sought his endorsement. He tried to use this visibility carefully. He amplified voices of other activists, especially those without his platform or resources. He directed attention to ongoing problems rather than celebrating past victories. He reminded people constantly that sustained effort was required to maintain progress. His relationship with Commander Zelith had evolved into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect. They met regularly to discuss enforcement trends and challenges. Zelith had been promoted to regional commander overseeing enforcement on 6 stations. She used this expanded authority to implement bias reduction programs across her entire region. She credited Marcus and the human community with teaching her how to be a better leader. During one of their meetings, Zelith shared concerning data. "We are seeing some backsliding on Station Kepler 442, she said. "Discriminatory stops are starting to increase again. Not dramatically, but the trend is moving in the wrong direction. I think we are dealing with newer officers who did not experience the initial reforms. They joined after the crisis passed and they do not fully understand why the protocols matter." Marcus was not entirely surprised. "This is the challenge with institutional change," he said. "The people who fought for reforms remember why they matter. The people who come later just see rules they have to follow. We need regular refresher training. We need to tell the story of what happened and why it mattered. We need to keep the history alive so people understand the purpose behind the policies." They worked together to develop a solution. The Foundation created a training module that told the story of Marcus's arrest and the subsequent reforms. It included testimony from Carl Newton and Nicole Hayes and others who had experienced discrimination. It showed the data on how bias affected enforcement patterns. It explained why the reforms were necessary and how they improved outcomes for everyone. This module became required training for all new enforcement officers and annual refresher training for existing personnel. The backsliding stopped and the positive trends resumed, but the incident reinforced an important lesson. Progress required constant maintenance. Systems naturally drifted back toward old patterns unless people actively worked to prevent it. This meant that advocacy and monitoring could never stop. It meant that each generation would need to learn the lessons and fight the same battles in new contexts. Marcus saw this pattern across all the Foundation's work. They would achieve a victory in one area and then need to defend it while simultaneously pushing forward in other areas. It was exhausting work, but Marcus drew energy from seeing real improvements in people's lives. When Carl Newton told him that he had not been stopped inappropriately in 6 months, it made all the effort worthwhile. When Nicole Hayes reported that new protocols prevented students from being questioned invasively, it justified the countless hours of advocacy. The movement had also inspired other species to address discrimination within their own communities. A coalition of Xanthari activists formed to fight discrimination their species faced in certain sectors. They explicitly modeled their approach on the human methods of documentation and coalition building. A group of Dronai refugees used similar tactics to address exploitation they experienced in labor markets. The tools and strategies developed by humans were proving useful across many different contexts. This cross-species solidarity represented something new in the galaxy. Different groups were learning from each other and supporting each other's fights for justice. A Xanthari activist leader visited Marcus to discuss strategy. "Your species showed us something important," the activist said. "You showed us that persistence works. You demonstrated that peaceful, organized resistance can overcome institutional power. You proved that it is possible to win even when the system seems stacked against you." Marcus appreciated the recognition, but he also wanted to acknowledge complexity. "We learned these strategies over centuries of struggle on Earth," he said. "We refined them through generations of activism. We paid a terrible price in suffering and lost lives to develop this knowledge. I am glad we can share what we learned, but I also want to honor all the humans who fought before us. They laid the foundation that made our work possible." The Zenthari activist nodded thoughtfully. "That historical consciousness is also something we can learn from humans," he said. "You remember your struggles. You teach your children about the fights previous generations won. You maintain awareness of how hard each advance was to achieve. My species tends to forget our history. We assume current conditions are natural, rather than the result of past battles. Your example reminds us to stay vigilant." These conversations about movement building and historical memory happened alongside the daily work of addressing individual cases of discrimination. The Foundation's legal team represented humans facing unfair treatment. Their advocacy team supported community organizing. Their research team documented patterns and published reports. Their training team taught people how to recognize and respond to discrimination. Every day brought new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference. Marcus maintained his connection to Blake Stellar Motors even as his advocacy work expanded. The dealership remained successful and continued to provide employment opportunities for beings from marginalized groups. Marcus saw the business as part of his broader mission. It demonstrated that fair treatment and inclusive practices were not just morally right, but also practically successful. The dealership's growth showed that you could run a profitable business while actively working to counteract discrimination. On the second anniversary of his arrest, Marcus gave a speech at a foundation fundraising event. The room was filled with supporters from many different species. Human activists sat next to alien allies. Enforcement officers who embraced reform attended alongside community members they served. It was a visible representation of the coalition they had built. 2 years ago, I was handcuffed on the ground outside my own business, Marcus began. It was humiliating and frightening. In that moment, I felt powerless. But that experience connected me to something larger than myself. It connected me to every human who had ever experienced discrimination. It connected me to centuries of struggle for justice and equality. And it showed me that individual incidents of injustice are symptoms of systemic problems that require systemic solutions. He paused and looked around the room. "We have accomplished so much in 2 years," he continued. "But we have not won. We have achieved progress, not victory. Discrimination still exists. Bias still affects how people are treated. We still have work to do in enforcement and housing and employment and education and many other areas. This work will continue for years, probably for generations. But I believe we can succeed because we are building something sustainable. We are creating institutions and training programs and documentation systems that will outlast any individual. We are teaching people skills and strategies they can pass on. We are changing culture slowly but surely." The audience applauded. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility, but also the support of community. He was not fighting alone. Thousands of people were engaged in this work across many locations. They were learning from each other and supporting each other. That collective effort was humanity's real strength, not individual brilliance or physical power, but the ability to organize persistent resistance to injustice over long periods of time. That was humanity at its best, and it was changing the galaxy. 3 years after the incident, Marcus Blake stood in the showroom of Blake Stellar Motors and watched his staff help customers from 6 different species. The dealership had become the largest vehicle seller in the sector. But more than that, it had become a symbol of what was possible when businesses committed to fairness and opportunity for all beings, regardless of background or appearance. The Fusion cruiser that started everything was gone, but Marcus kept a photograph of it on his office wall. Not the vehicle itself, but the moment of his arrest. The image showed him on the ground with energy cuffs on his wrists while enforcement officers stood over him. Below the photograph was a caption he had written himself. "Remember where we started, so we appreciate how far we have come and stay motivated to keep going." Commander Zelith had requested a meeting for this afternoon. She arrived exactly on time as always. Marcus greeted her warmly and they walked through the dealership together. The changes in their relationship over 3 years represented a broader shift in how enforcement and communities interacted. Trust had been rebuilt slowly through consistent effort on both sides. They settled in Marcus's office overlooking the showroom floor. Zelith had brought data to share. I wanted you to see the latest numbers, she said as she activated a holographic display. Discriminatory stops are down 81% compared to 3 years ago across my entire region. Complaints about unfair treatment are down 74%. Community trust in enforcement has increased significantly according to regular surveys. Officer satisfaction has also improved because they have better training and clearer guidelines. Marcus studied the data carefully. These are impressive results, he said. But tell me honestly, are you seeing any concerning trends or areas where progress has stalled? Zelith appreciated his focus on problems rather than just celebrating successes. We still have challenges with housing discrimination, she admitted. Enforcement of fair housing laws is inconsistent. We document violations, but prosecution rates are low. The legal standards are complex and proving discriminatory intent is difficult. We need new approaches. That is actually perfect timing, Marcus said. The Foundation is launching a major housing initiative next month. We have been developing testing protocols where matched pairs of applicants with different species or skin colors apply for the same housing. When one is accepted and the other rejected despite identical qualifications, we have clear evidence of discrimination. Would your department be willing to partner with us on enforcement? Zelith nodded immediately. Absolutely. That kind of clear evidence makes prosecution much easier. I will assign dedicated officers to work with your team. This is exactly the kind of collaboration that produces results. They spent the next hour discussing implementation details. This was how change happened, Marcus reflected. Not through grand gestures, but through detailed planning and sustained cooperation between people who had once been adversaries. The work was often tedious, but it was effective. After Zelith left, Marcus reviewed his schedule for the coming week. He had a speech at a university on a nearby station. He had 3 meetings with Foundation staff about various initiatives. He had a video interview with a journalist writing about the spread of enforcement reforms across the galaxy. He also had to finalize a vehicle order for a client and review expansion plans for the dealership. The balance between business and advocacy remained challenging, but Marcus had learned to manage both. Lisa Grant stopped by his office in the late afternoon. She no longer worked at the dealership daily, but she maintained close connections. I wanted to give you an update on the Foundation's reach, she said. We now have active programs or partnerships in 43 locations across 8 sectors. Our training materials have been translated into 17 languages. We have provided direct assistance to over 5,000 individuals facing discrimination. The movement has grown beyond anything we imagined 3 years ago. Marcus felt pride mixed with awareness of how much work remained. That is remarkable growth, he said, but we need to be careful not to expand faster than we can maintain quality. Better to do excellent work in 40 locations than mediocre work in 80 locations. How are we ensuring consistency across all these programs? Lisa explained the quality control systems they had implemented, regular training for partner organizations, detailed documentation requirements, ongoing evaluation and feedback. She had built a sophisticated infrastructure to support the Foundation's expanding reach. Marcus trusted her completely to manage these operational details. As evening approached, Marcus walked through the dealership one more time. A human family was examining a mid-range transport vehicle. A Xanthari couple looked at luxury cruisers. A mixed group of Dronai and Vrex discussed the specifications of a cargo hauler. This diversity of customers reflected the changes that had occurred over 3 years. His dealership had become known as a place that welcomed everyone equally. One of his sales staff approached. The Xanthari couple is ready to close on the luxury cruiser, she said. They specifically mentioned that they chose us because of your reputation for fair dealing. Marcus smiled and walked over to finalize the sale. This was the part of his work that he still loved most, helping customers find the right vehicle, building relationships through honest business practices, demonstrating that commercial success and ethical behavior were not contradictory. The dealership provided the foundation that made all his other work possible. Later that night, Marcus sat in his apartment and reflected on the past 3 years. His life had changed dramatically from that afternoon, when enforcement officers handcuffed him outside his own business. That moment of injustice had led to a movement that improved lives for thousands of beings across multiple sectors. It had created lasting institutions and changed policies. It had built bridges between species and between communities and enforcement agencies. But Marcus also knew the work was not finished. Discrimination still existed. Bias still affected how people were treated. New challenges kept emerging as society evolved. The fight for justice and equality was not something that could be won once and then forgotten. It required constant vigilance and sustained effort. Each generation would need to learn these lessons and carry on the struggle in their own time and context. This was perhaps the most fundamentally human thing about the entire situation. The absolute refusal to accept injustice as permanent or inevitable, the stubborn insistence that things could and should be better, the willingness to organize and persist and fight for generations if necessary to create a more fair society. Other species found this exhausting. They often wished humans would just accept current conditions and stop making trouble. But humans could not do that. It was not in their nature. Marcus thought about all the humans throughout history who had fought similar battles. The civil rights activists on Earth who marched and protested and sometimes died to end segregation and discrimination. The labor organizers who built unions to protect workers from exploitation. The suffragettes who demanded voting rights. The abolitionists who fought slavery. The countless individuals who stood up against injustice in small ways and large throughout human history. They were all connected by the same stubborn refusal to accept wrong as right. Now humans were bringing that same spirit to the galaxy. They were teaching other species that change was possible. They were demonstrating that peaceful, organized resistance could overcome institutional power. They were proving that persistence and documentation and coalition building could transform systems. This was humanity's contribution to galactic civilization. Not superior technology or physical strength, but the knowledge of how to fight for justice effectively over long periods of time. Marcus received a message on his communication device. It was from Carl Newton, the maintenance worker who had been stopped 17 times before the reforms. The message was simple but meaningful. I walked home from work tonight and no one stopped me. Thank you for making that possible. Marcus read the message twice. This was why the work mattered. Not for grand political victories or historical recognition, but for simple everyday freedoms. The freedom to walk home without harassment. The freedom to stand next to your own property without being arrested. The freedom to teach in your own classroom without being questioned. These basic dignities that everyone deserved regardless of their species or appearance. This was what they had fought for, and this was what they would continue fighting for as long as necessary. He typed a reply to Carl. You made it possible too by speaking up and sharing your story. We all did this together. Keep documenting your experiences and staying involved. The work continues. Marcus stood and looked out his window at the lights of trading station Kepler 442. 3 years ago, he had been a successful businessman focused on running his dealership. Now he was part of a movement that was changing how beings treated each other across multiple sectors. The change had come from tragedy, but it had produced real lasting improvements in people's lives. That was very human. Taking bad situations and refusing to let them be meaningless. Finding purpose in struggle. Building something better from the ruins of injustice. This was humanity at its best, and the galaxy was learning from their example.